Call for the doctor, call for the nurse. Wait for tomorrow and watch.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Shout conference. We are at session 2 for today on change and the land. We're going to talk about change today by thinking about how we can become more globally competent. Why does it matter today, and what does it look like when we're all being globally competent and confident for that matter? We're going to meet Veronica Boix Mansilla in just a moment. I did want to thank our friends at Smithsonian Folkways for that great song, a great calypso song called If We Don't Fix It. And you can find more at Smithsonian Folkways website to check out that album if you liked it, and many others. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to jump right in. I wanted to remind you that this is session 2 of 3 today. We just finished up a little while ago with the art of science, and we'll be turning towards the soil right after Veronica's session, so we hope you'll stay tuned for that as well. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the 3 partners that have brought the Shout Conference to you today. That is the Smithsonian, Microsoft Partners in Learning, and Taking It Global together have formed shoutlearning.org. And of course, shoutlearning.org is all about you sharing your work and your feedback on issues that relate to exploring, connecting, and acting when it comes to this year, the land. And that, of course, is the theme for today, change in the land. I did want to point out that our session is being closed captioned, so if you are finding those captions useful, you can continue to use them at the lower part of your screen. If for any reason they're distracting or you need to turn them off, you can click the little CC button on the right and then choose captions from the display menu to turn on, or the none button to turn them off. All right. I also want to do a special shout out in true Shout Learning fashion to our friends joining us from New Brunswick, Canada, Laura Vale and her 5th grade students at the New Maryland School, and also Ian Fogarty, who's a chemistry and physics and science teacher, and he's joining us from New Brunswick as well. And a big shout out to everyone else here. I already see that we have people welcoming us from wherever they are across the planet, just so that we can keep our attention on the good questions and comments that are coming in around the particular topic on global competence today. We hope that you can limit the posting just to the questions and prompts and in response to other questions and comments people put in. It's great to see people greeting each other, which is wonderful, but we want to make sure we don't miss some of your great questions and responses to the ones we'll be asking. So we'll ask everyone to focus now on this great topic. By the way, my name is Jonathan. I'll be your host, and together with my colleague Adam, we are keeping our eyes out for your comments, and we hope you will keep them coming. Do note that the chat box on the left is open throughout the session, and Adam and I receive those comments, and we'll share those with Veronica as we go along. Also, one last note: if you're not in front of a keyboard today, but you do have the ability to reach for Twitter, you can tag your questions or comments with the hashtag or the #, ShoutLearn. And we'll keep our eyes out for anything you post on that to Twitter. And we're also on Facebook at facebook.com/shoutlearning. One last piece of information. We are joined today by our friend Chris, who joins us from London. And while all of you may be listening carefully, and maybe some of you are taking notes, Chris is taking notes in the form of an illustration. You're looking at some illustrations he's done from prior Shout sessions, but here is a live feed of Chris's desktop computer in London, and we're looking over his shoulder on his screen right now and bringing it up a little bit larger. Chris is going to be trying to follow along our discussion, and he is going to draw what he hears from us and from Veronica today and try to organize our thoughts a little bit. And then within the next couple of days, we'll post that to the Shout Learning website so that you can enjoy it in completed state as well. Okay, so thanks, Chris. We'll tune in and check in with you a little bit later. It's now my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Veronica Boix Mansilla, who is going to lead us on this discussion and this exploration of global competence. Veronica, thanks for being here today.
No, thank you, Jonathan. I am delighted to be here, and here is, of course, in quotations because we are all over the place. And I think it's uniquely pertinent that we would meet online in this particular fashion in order to talk about what it means to be globally competent and why global competence might be a very important goal for education, for the future of education. So why talk about global competence today? It is, over the last decade, it has become increasingly clear for all of us that the models of schooling and museum education of the 19th century are no longer adept to prepare our young for the 21st century. These 19th century institutions, if you think about them, were modeled after the Industrial Revolution. They tended to emphasize rote transmission of fixed information, standardization, uniformity. All children learn the same thing. All teachers know the same content. In contrast, the so-called 21st century education movement has sought to replace this industrial education model with a plethora of powerful new skills that highlight complexity, adaptability, creativity, participation. And we've all heard about 21st century education and the new demand. So, for example, we're hoping that the young people who are prepared for the 21st century to be able to design and evaluate and manage their work for improvement. We expect them to be able to solve problems using a wide range of tools and resources. We expect them to collaborate with others strategically. We expect them to find and analyze information, to develop new products and ideas. So you've all heard the variety of very important skills that we're expecting our students to develop for the 21st century. Now, in my mind, surprisingly absent from our public debates about 21st century education and from several of these skills is students' substantive and deep understanding of issues of global significance. This is especially surprising when we consider that preparing our students or preparing our young generations to do the work of their generation involves getting them ready to engage in very thorny problems. Let me show you a few examples. For instance, we're learning that economic integration around the globe is yielding a new division of labor. Routine tasks are no longer as relevant as they used to be, and now we would like to have people who are prepared in expert thinking. Of course, we expect students to find jobs, but we might also expect students to make sense of the interdependent economies that define their lives and set standards for their opportunities. We may want to have students understand the global labor markets of which they are becoming a part. Consider the example of migration, cultural encounters. Around the world, migration is reaching unprecedented proportions and speed, changing the demographics of classrooms and neighborhoods, and preparing students for a world in this case, or that considering the migratory patterns that are defining our lives, involves that we help them understand that the new kid from Lebanon or Turkey who is right now in their classrooms is actually a local instantiation of a much, much broader global phenomenon that involves about 200 million people around the world who are migrating to different places, all participating in multiple national realities at the same time, all operating with multiple cultural frames. Consider yet another example, the case of the digital revolution. So in the very much as we're experiencing right now, one of the things that the digital revolution is doing for us, it's allowing us unprecedented proximity. At the click of a key, we're able to understand what's happening. We're able to know or have information about what's happening in Japan, the crisis that unfolds. And this proximity is developing it's creating on the one hand more connectivity. We come to know more about people's lives in other places. But it's also developing fear of and cultural retreat. Sometimes people's lives in other places feel threatening to many around the world. So again here, to understand how the digital revolution works and how it's shaping our minds to maximize its promise and to sidestep its force seems of the essence. Many of you have also been working on other very, very important challenges of the land, if you wish. The question of elusive human rights, the question of population explosion. Are we going to be able to feed all of the population as it's growing? And clearly the question of environmental instability. Now, these are the problems that the students in our classrooms and in our museums and in our communities today will have to address, will have to live with, will have to make sense of. What's common across all of these problems is that they demand international, global solutions. So to prepare students for the world that's coming to them, the world in which of which they're part, seems to require that we prepare them to do international work, to participate in global communities. For today, I would like first to consider two important questions. One is, what does it mean to be globally competent?
And Veronica, on this important question, we've actually taken a question from a little bit earlier before we started, and we've posted it on the left. In order to think about this issue, we're asking people to think about someone they know who might be globally competent, who understands issues of global significance in depth and seems to be able to act on what they learn. So as you think about someone who you think might, we haven't really gone purely into this definition yet, but as you think about what globally competent might mean and someone you think might be globally competent, tell us about that person.
That's right, and we can see already very important and interesting responses. So a globally competent person is somebody who's aware, somebody who watches the news. Some folks are saying somebody who accepts others, who cooperates with others, somebody who's open-minded. We're having fabulous responses to this very question of what does it mean to be globally competent. Mm-hmm.
We're also seeing things like they appreciate or have an appreciation for diversity, and they know about people in other parts of the world. That's
right. And it's not only tolerance. I love the word appreciation there. It's not only tolerance for diversity, as sometimes it is, right? But it's appreciation for diversity. Through our diversity, we can be better together than individually, so to speak.
Janet mentions a Japanese professor of art education that she knows who thinks of himself as a citizen of the world, not of any one country.
Exactly. I think that's a very, very interesting response, because it has to do with the fact that global competence sometimes, or in an important way, is a matter of identity. Who do we feel we are? So it's not just a matter of a collection of skills that we can deploy, but it's also very, very much a question of identity. And some previous work that I've done, I've described it also as global consciousness. It's like, who am I and where do I stand vis-a-vis the globe as a whole? Who do I belong to? Where do I belong to? And what are my responsibilities accordingly?
On that point, Brady says it's someone who thinks about the world and not about themselves.
Yeah, true. Very, very inspiring. Mm-hmm.
So this is... Yes,
go ahead.
No, go right ahead. This is one question that we're tackling today, and I know there's a second question you mentioned as well.
That's right. So the second question is, how can we nurture global competence among our youth? What does it look like in student work, and how can we nurture it best? Okay. So clearly, as you probably guessed, I'm about to define global competence, and I have to say that this definition stems from a panel or a task force that I had the pleasure of being part of. This task force was led by the CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers in the U.S., and the Asia Society, and in collaboration with a variety of curriculum experts from across the nation and the U.S. and scholars, with whom, through a process of about 2 years, we came to define what it might mean to be globally competent. And let me share with you the definition that we came up with and some of the qualities of this definition. The definition, as well as some more extensive inquiry into this problem space, is coming up in a book that Tony Jackson, the VP, Vice President for Education at the Asia Society, and I are writing. And we have defined global competence as the capacity and the disposition to understand and act issues of global significance. So, for example, as we think, and as so many of you already shared, as we think about globally competent individuals, we think about people who are aware, as you said, and curious about the world beyond their immediate environments, not only about themselves, but about the world, as somebody said. We think about people who are informed by disciplines and interdisciplinary work, which I know that many of you do. We think about individuals who are inclined to reflect and to act on the basis of nuance and critical thinking. Not thoughtless action, but informed action. So, for example, these days we've had a chance to encounter the tragic developments in Japan, and the images that I'm sharing with you on your screen are images that have become sort of very much part of our consciousness these days, and we're all learning about Japan. We're all asking new questions. And the globally competent student or the globally competent person would not only read the headlines of the news, but be impossibly curious, needing to know more, needing to ask the questions of what caused the leak of radioactive material. How is it that radioactivity is harmful to the health of human beings? What are the consequences of this crisis? We might expect students or adults to ask the question of how is it that individuals are making sense of this problem. And we would certainly be well informed in order to begin to sort of find our way into this very complex and dynamic and ever-changing and rapidly changing problem space by understanding something about the backdrop of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in this particular context, by understanding something about the possible implications of this terrifying crisis, with in light of our debates about clean energy solutions, climate change, and so forth. We may want to understand something about sort of patterns of identity and culture in Japan to see how it is that the Japanese friends in Japan are sort of expressing their views and their sentiments around this. And cultures express, individuals in different cultures tend to have different patterns of expression. So understanding those would be important. So confronted with a crisis of this scope, the globally competent person goes one step beyond, not only being tangentially aware of what's going on, but really inquiring, really taking perspective, really trying to find a way to participate, to act, to contribute. In looking at how to nurture global competence, and in a minute we're going to turn our attention to a particular example of a student work. In looking as to how to nurture global competence, we have identified 4 realms or 4 dimensions that we might want to pay attention to. One is the capacity to investigate the world. Students investigate the world beyond their immediate environments. They can use sources from multiple languages, multiple nations, multiple regions. Number 2, or second dimension, students take perspective to students are able not only to understand that they have their own perspective and their own position that is very culturally bound, class-bound, regionally bound, bound by their environments and by their personal histories, as well as the perspectives of others. And again, it's not only a matter of recognizing that people have different perspectives, but also trying to understand the influences on those perspectives. Number 3, or a third dimension of global competence, is the capacity to communicate ideas with diverse audiences. Here again, we're expected students will be able to understand the communicative patterns or the styles of communication, or that recognize that when they're speaking to a particular audience, this audience may be very diverse, very much as we're doing right now as we exchange notes on the sidebar. We're speaking to individuals who have very different life histories and have common interests. Being aware of that diversity and aware of how to communicate, how to use symbols to get our messages across is important. And finally, of course, as so many of you are mentioning on the sidebars as well, is the responsibility to take action, to take ethical, critical, and creative action to address problems of today, to address problems that are of global significance.
Veronica, I just wanted to point out a couple of interesting comments that have come in as you've been sharing this. One person is curious as to whether one needs to be culturally competent to become globally competent. Is that a prerequisite?
I don't think that there's a linear progression as to how it is that one becomes globally competent. I think that there are many various different pathways to become globally competent, and I believe also that as adults we continue to struggle to become better at global competence, better at understanding the world. Is a person the very interesting debates today in anthropology, for example, about what constitutes culture and how we can come to understand culture, and whether we understand culture as a bounded, Japanese culture, American culture, or whether we understand culture as very much the experience and representations that people have of their lives and the things that we all do. So I would not say that there's a stepwise progression. You first need to understand culture and then you become globally competent. I think that you work on all of these dispositions at the same time, little by little, in different contexts.
Great, and I see some good follow-up to that among our colleagues who are logged in. Excellent.
All right, so the question is, what does global competent work look like in a student's work? I bring a student's work to the conversation because I think that is the way in which we can establish a most productive dialogue about what we mean, what we would like to see. And of course, each piece of student work, the pieces of student work that you're producing in your classrooms, will bring to light particular aspects of global competence. But here's what I would like to do. I would like to introduce this case. This is a student work coming out of a classroom in Boston Latin. Judy Freeman is a history teacher who employs a great deal of the arts in her course. This is a 11th, 12th grade Facing History in Ourselves course, which is a course on human rights and history, and taking history very, very seriously to understand issues of genocide and human rights and civic participation. So unlike some of your other examples throughout this conference, this is not going to be an environment example in the sense of natural environments, but I'm hoping that we think about it as an urban environment type of example, and what students do when thinking about the urban environments in which they live. Here are some of the questions that Judy raises in her course. She asks, why do basic human rights and essential notions of justice seem so obvious, and yet so elusive? Very global question if you think about it. Another question. What are our basic human rights? How are they guaranteed? How have they been violated in this nation as well as in other parts of the world? Another question the course raises. What is our role as individual citizens of a nation and of the world? How have individuals sought to secure and guarantee human rights in places around the world? So throughout the course, the students do an in-depth investigation of the genocides of the 20th century. This is a world history class. And they come to learn not only about the Holocaust, which is like her central case study, but students are also invited to choose a particular case of mass killing and investigate it in some depth. With the end of the course, the students are invited to produce a monument that would speak to something important that they have learned from the particular case that they have studied. So students' monuments about Rwandan genocide, about Chile, about Argentina, about a variety of crises of this kind. And they are tasked with memorializing it, either honoring victims or illuminating some particular aspect of this particular genocides that they have studied. The examples I would like to call your attention to is one done by a student called Brian. Brian graduated, and it's a memorial towards the nuclear bomb victims in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, very much on our minds today, I am sure. Brian graduated from high school several years ago, and Jonathan invited me to see if we could find him again after several years to see if he would be ready to read the essay that accompanies his memorial for us. What you see in front of you is the maquette that he was expected to produce at the end of the course, and you probably notice sort of impersonal buildings. You probably also notice, if you look closely, a collection of shadows or human silhouettes on these buildings. So, Jonathan, if we can run Brian's reading of his essay, if you look right next to the maquette, you'll see a piece of paper which includes Brian's essay, and that is what he will read for us. Now, as Brian reads the essay, I would love to invite us all to think about what aspects of global competence Brian seems to exhibit in the essay about the nuclear bomb victims memorial. And I know that you have the option of clicking on the essay itself or clicking on the image if you prefer to follow the essay, Brian's reading, by reading yourself.
Great. And Veronica, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the actual essay and allow people to scroll through it as they listen, if they wish. And we're going to sit back and you can follow along and listen to Brian.
Hello, Brian. So thank you so much for agreeing to read your essay for us. Would you mind doing it? Sounds great.
Yes.
Oh, and actually one more thing. As we listen, Veronica, I've put up the 4 capacities of global competence. On the left side, investigate the world, communicate ideas, take perspectives, and take action. As you listen and read, tell us about things that you think may exhibit these different forms of competence. And you can put a little parenthesis next to your comment. I, C, P, or A for investigate, communicate, perspective, or action. Okay? Let's go ahead and listen to Brian.
Near the political and military centers of command where the bombings were directed. The silhouettes in all locations would be painted in the locations and orientations where actual shadows would have been cast by victims as the bombs went off. In regards to Washington, D.C., the shadows would be positioned as if the light from the nuclear explosions had traveled all the way around the world. Each silhouette would be accompanied by a small plaque listing the name or names of real-life victims who might have cast a shadow just like the painted silhouettes. It would be impossible to determine the exact location and positions of real victims when the bombs went off, but they could be approximated and real names matched with corresponding body types and genders. A central information kiosk with a map, further names, and basic information about the bombings in many languages would exist nearby any groupings of silhouettes. The intended audience of this memorial is twofold. In one regard, it is a monument to the lives of victims and is targeted at descendants and survivors of the blasts to recognize the potential that was lost and the emotional gap that people have to live with. In another regard, the target is government leaders and policymakers, both of the past and present. Past leaders would be haunted by the ghosts of the innocent civilians who died at their discretion, and present leaders would feel the pressure of lives lost in the past weigh upon the decisions that they must make in the present. This memorial does not take a side and say whether the bombings were a good or bad decision, a horrible mistake, or a difficult step that had to be taken. Instead, it recognizes the huge loss of life that resulted and stands as a reminder that victims are functioning members of society, not just numbers. The exhibit is intended to be similar to one in Berlin, which has signposts describing Nazi laws persecuting Jews sprinkled throughout a neighborhood. The silhouettes would not directly intrude upon people's lives, cause inconvenience, or attract large numbers of tourists. However, they would stand as a constant reminder of the empty holes in our society by the use of nuclear weaponry and the impact that military decisions made from across the globe have on real human lives. The purpose is to integrate the memorial into people's lives and to make the remembrance of victims an everyday part of life as opposed to a once-in-a-while optional visit to a remote or isolated monument.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was beautifully done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, and we're back with all of you.
And we can take a little bit of time to digest what Brian just said. Feel free to share with us your views. But when you're ready, we have a collection of questions to gather your sense of how you interpret this work. Jonathan, can we put our
Yes, let's go ahead.
questions up?
We're going to move the piece off to the side so we can take a look at some of these questions together. Okay. So here's our first question. How evident is Brian's global competence in this example? What would you choose? And I'll show you the results so you can see how your thoughts match up with everyone else who's here with us today. Most people are saying it's either somewhat or very evident. Well, the vast majority are saying it's very evident.
Mm-hmm. I think that it is. It's wonderful to have your sense of how very evident or somewhat evident global competence is in this kind of work, and of course I would die to have us all sort of in a room to try to figure out why it is that you voted in one way or another, whether very evident, somewhat evident, or not evident, not very evident. So feel free to continue to feed in your views on the sidebar. Jonathan, can we move to the second question?
Yes.
See, in this question, we're going to try to see what evidence we see, or what's the sort of general sense of Brian's work in terms of which aspects of global competence he seems to be exhibiting. Is there good evidence of investigating the world?
We have a good question on this as people are putting in their votes. There's a question from Laura. Could the memorial that Brian designed be seen as global action? Would it fit under that fourth competence? What do you think, Veronica?
I think it certainly could, and I believe that I'll share in a minute. I will share some excerpts from an interview that we had with Brian at the time, essentially in which he very, very much views his participation in history through the lens of having produced this memorial. Good. Get a quick sense of the different dimensions of global competence that folks have seen in this piece of work.
By the way, I wanted to draw our attention to a comment that came in earlier from Jennifer in Arizona. She, in response to the initial question about how can we produce globally competent students, Jennifer said, well, maybe we could get them to care and feel intrinsic empathy and interest for global affairs and issues. And as you were reflecting on Brian's essay, Desiree in Etobicoke said, well, and how can we as teachers develop a level of empathy that's demonstrated in Brian's writing? Is that aspect of global competence, empathy, something that we can all learn and that can be cultivated by our teachers?
I certainly think that we learn to be empathic. I certainly think that part of the beauty of this work on global competence is that it puts students and us as adults on a pathway of learning that is a never-ending pathway of learning. I mean, just to give you a very personal example, I am originally from Argentina. I have lived in Brazil. I have lived in the United States for many, many years, and I am eternally surprised and eternally discovering aspects of my own changing Argentinian sort of environment and this fascinating country in which I have lived for so many years. So I think that the beauty of this is that very much as it's happening with Japan today, in which we're all of a sudden getting sort of immersion lessons on nuclear power and on crisis management and on channels for donation and participation. Global competence does that with us and for us because it awakens our alertness, it awakens our empathy for others. The more we know about the lives of others and the more we interact personally with others, the better we are at taking perspective, recognizing and explaining the perspectives of others, even if sometimes, initially perspectives might seem different, strange to us, but we learn to interpret them in more informed ways.
We're seeing people's response as they digest the question on the upper left part of the screen about what additional evidence would we need from Brian to discern whether he is developing global competence beyond what you saw in this essay and in this memorial design. And we're starting to see about 2/3 people think that an interview that makes Brian's thinking and attitudes visible.
That's great, and I certainly I couldn't agree more in the sense that we were lucky enough to interview Brian, and I'm eager to share with you some of the things that we have found through that interview, because I believe it allowed us to see the complexity of his thinking. Clearly, the historical research report would allow us to understand a little bit more about how he did his research, how he used sources. Clearly, for many of us, we are still, and he is still struggling many years later about the decision, the complexity of that decision of the bombs. So I love your responses to that question, because it allows, they remind us of the importance of not picking just one piece of work as evidence of global competence, but really considering multiple ways in which we can get at our students' thinking, and that's very important for us to be able to do. Let me move us forward, Jonathan, unless there are any particular questions that you would like us to address. But let me move us forward into unpacking a little bit some of the dimensions of global competence that I described earlier. And a lot of this work you'll find links and attachments on this site to what we have come to call the 8 steps global competence matrices. I'm going to show you an image of them a little bit later in the game, so you'll have plenty of detailed descriptions of some of these qualities, as well as descriptions of how these qualities might look like in different subjects, science, and social studies, and the arts, and mathematics. But essentially, when we think about investigating the world, we're hoping that students like Brian are able to identify issues that are of global significance. Let me read for you. Okay, so we want them to identify issues that are of global significance. We want them to be able to identify and use and interpret a variety of sources, not only sources that are representing points of view that he's used to, but other sources as well. To analyze and synthesize this evidence around these issues of global significance, and to develop an argument that is based on evidence. Now, to the first point of identifying a topic of global significance, let me briefly quote from the interview, because I think that it describes Brian's thinking in a beautiful way. He says, I had to visualize in my mind, in deciding what to, how to represent this event. He says, I had to visualize in my mind exactly what it was like at that moment, what those people were doing at that very moment. The monument captured that moment for me, the moment the whole earth stood still. People make a big deal about the Revolutionary War and the shot heard around the world. This is really the explosions heard around the world. Everybody knew about it, and this whole nuclear era kicked off. This was an incredibly important moment. So here, in my opinion, Brian convinces us of the significance, the global significance of his choice of the nuclear bomb memorial, but not of his choice of nuclear bomb, not as as all possible bombs, but as this very particularly significant event. Let's take a look at taking perspective. So when we think about taking perspective, we think about, as I said a bit earlier, recognizing that we do have an influence, that we do have perspectives ourselves, that it involves understanding cultural interactions, it involves understanding or articulating how access to information and to technologies and so forth affects the lives of individuals. Again, we're reminded of the crisis in Japan and what that crisis would have looked like if it had happened in a place like Haiti, where another equally moving crisis a few months ago. Now, Brian encounters the question or exhibits this complexity of perspective in the following passage of this interview. Here, I would like for you to pay attention to how he's weaving U.S. policy perspective, Russian perspective, and Japanese perspectives at the same time, maintaining complexity in his thought, in my opinion. Well, he says, it's easy to look now and say that all these people died, but you couldn't have known where they were, could have gone. Obviously, it was a horrible thing. There was no easy way just to end the war that I could see. maybe more diplomatic options like a blockade or something. I don't really buy too much into that. Well, we're just trying to show the Soviets that we had the technology, because there are easier ways to do that. We did the Manhattan Project, and they knew that. They're still victims, you know. So here he is considering three different perspectives at the same time, as he struggles with the moral decision as to what the implications of the bomb were, without, of course, losing sight of the pain it caused. And of course, we may agree or disagree with his conclusions or his moral dilemma, but I think it's interesting to see how he conceives of perspectives at once. Communicate ideas. Now, if we are to nurture global competence among the young, we need to prepare them to communicate in sophisticated and complex ways, especially with people who may think in very different ways about the ideas that they're talking about the ideas they're expressing or listening to. So here there are a few qualities that seem relevant. Recognizing the diversity in an audience, listening and communicating effectively, employing media appropriately, technology, media, and reflecting on the complexities of communication. I wonder where you saw communicating perspectives in your in Brian's essay, or communicating ideas with diverse audiences in Brian's essay or in Brian's memorial. Shall we give it a try? So where did we see evidence of communicating with diverse audiences in Brian's memorial? Would you like to type in your thoughts on the sidebar?
And while people review their thoughts and review the essay, I just wanted to point out, Veronica, that we're having a lot of great discussion here about where global competence begins and the whole topic of how empathy can be learned, taught, or cultivated, and a lot of suggestions about how we can find ways of teaching these things in our sometimes structured school and classroom environments. But here to answer your question, Heather has jumped in with a response in the chat area. The memorial touches both people in Japan and people in the U.S. Angela in Yerevan says that Brian's memorial clearly hits perspective aspect because of his idea of putting the memorial in Japan and the United States.
And that's right. And he quite literally says, you know, the memorial would have a very different meaning. These very shadows will mean very different things, depending on where you place them, right? So understanding that is part of the challenge. How a particular body gesture, a particular term, a particular turn-taking in a conversation, style of turn-taking in a conversation means different things to different people, depending on what their frame of mind is as they arrive to that interaction. Jonathan, can we go back to the slides so that I can share with you sort of the final qualities of this final dimension, and yet extremely important dimension of taking action. Here too, if we're preparing students for the world to participate as environmental activists, if you wish, or as urban designers, as artists, as scientists, if we're thinking about them participating and taking action around the issues of global significance that we and they think are critical, we need to teach them how to find and create opportunities for action. This is something that is not that obviously part of the regular curriculum. Allowing students to, or creating in students the habit of identifying opportunities for action, not letting the world go by, but saying, "Hey, this is an opportunity for action," is one of our beautiful challenges ahead. Another one is assessing options and plan actions and consider the antecedents of consequence. Of course, we may have very confident students ready to jump into action, but wait a minute, what happened before? How have other people tried to address this particular case? Act personally, collaboratively, creatively, and ethically, and reflect on our capacity to make a difference and the challenges of doing so. So let me share what Brian has to say, and I think, in my opinion, this is one of the most beautiful moments in the interview. And this is what he says. He says, I knew the significance of the event and how many people died from reading the first-person narratives and reports. But then, and for those of you interested in empathy, I make an aside, this is especially relevant. But then you have to make a real monument, the real world. When you have to try to memorialize it, it makes it very personal. You have this responsibility to these people. You can't just, I'd feel bad just having a statue with a little plaque on it. Building the memorial definitely engaged me, because it makes, history interactive. It's like you're taking part in it. It's like, here's my contribution to history. These people died, and I did something about it instead of just knowing it and absorbing it for myself. I took part, I took action. I used art to make a point. And that makes history much, much more, alive. So I wonder, how many times we find ourselves in a position in which science, history, the arts, mathematics come alive, and they become the tools through which we make a difference, or we invite our students to make a difference in the world in which we live. I think it's a beautiful challenge for us to consider.
Veronica, it's also amazing to hear you cite that part of the interview about using art to take action, to make a point, to share feelings. In fact, we just experienced a great look at some artwork in our prior session about looking at how artists sometimes have an ability through their canvas, or in this case through Brian's words and his essay, to actually feel like they're contributing something, and to actually do so when it comes to the dialogue.
It's really very interesting, because the arts, for those of us interested in sort of helping students become more empathic and more caring and personalizing what they learn, one of the things about the arts that is so powerful is that in the arts, your personal history and your personal views matter enormously. You're not trying to be objective in the arts, so to speak. So you're allowed to bring your voice in. So when we combine the arts with domains like history, domains like science, domains or biology, then we have a very powerful combination in terms of making what students learn relevant and personal to them.
And Michelle has a great point. In the time, perhaps, since Brian made that piece, this has become even more the case. Michelle in New Hampshire says that once you do it in a kind of audio or video format, it can be presented not only locally, but shared globally through technology, and it lives beyond its original audience and its original presentation, which is very key.
That is so true, Michelle. I'm so glad you brought that up. And it's really sort of the most beautiful, ironic turn of events that Brian's monument ends up becoming sort of a little bit like a hallmark for us as we think about global competence, and to see how this medium has allowed us to bring new life to what was essentially a school task, a school assignment, right? But obviously it was not just a school assignment for Brian, neither is it for any of Judy's students. That's one of the beauties of her classroom.
Veronica, I know we're going to need to wrap up this amazing conversation in a few moments, and we'll be turning our attention to getting our hands dirty in a different way. We're talking about the soil in a moment, but I'm wondering if maybe you could leave us with some frameworks or some tips on how we can take this discussion to the next place.
Yeah. So so far you have been so far we have provided for you a variety of resources, and among them, which you ought to be able to find on the site, among them are the matrices for global competence that synthesize what you have seen, as well as 2 chapters that Tony and I made available. They're draft chapters, so I will ask for your forgiveness in advance for any changes that we will make for the final version. But it should be pretty much there. But there are 2 challenges that are particularly exciting to me that we have developed for you. One for teachers. And the challenge here is to pick a piece of student work, sort of a sample of student work, and gather with a few of your colleagues, say, a group of 5 or so, and follow what we have developed as a protocol conversation to analyze student work in a very step-by-step manner. I don't know, Jonathan, if we can show an image of the protocol or the challenge itself. Otherwise, I'm sure that you can click on it. Look at that, wonderful. So that's the teacher challenge. There is a website, the CCSSO website, where we are collecting samples of student work, and eventually we will have a variety, hopefully a very, very broad database of student work on global competence of a variety of different levels. So that should be exciting to do and participate in. The second challenge is a challenge for students. So if you are a student or if you have students who might be interested in some of this, we are calling on students to do a biography of somebody whom they admire or who represents global competence, and ideally to examine this person's life, influences on this person's life, significance of this person's life. And it could be the people, the chosen people may be famous people like Mandela or Mother Teresa, or they could very well be somebody in their community, somebody who's unknown, but yet embodies these very, very important qualities of being global citizens, of being globally competent individuals. And there will be a space for students to post their biographies that may have the shape of written work or videos or multimedia products. So with that, and with the challenge of a world that expects us to, as educators, to prepare our young for very important human challenges and opportunities, I am hoping that we're all sort of collectively inspired for the task of bringing global competence to the center of what we do, and reap the benefits of a well-prepared polity in the future.
Veronica Boix, Mansilla, thank you so much for leading us on this discussion today and helping us not only think about how we can help our students develop global competence, but perhaps even helping us think about where we fit in on all of these important parts of the framework. So thank you very much. I hope we'll carry with us this this knowledge into our future activities. I do want to remind you that on the Shout Learning website, we're going to have all the links to all of these resources that Veronica mentioned. We'll put them up on the linked out from the shoutlearning.org site, including the conferencing tool that Veronica just mentioned, the teacher challenge, the student challenges. Don't forget, each of the events here at Shout have a challenge associated with them. The challenge here is another challenge that goes along with the Global Competence task, and you'll find that on the website as well. So we hope you'll check that out. You can contribute as teachers at the partnersinlearningnetwork.com site. Also at the, you can have your students visit shout.tiged.org/land. Again, links to this all on shoutlearning.org. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter and to like us on Facebook. We like that you're here with us and hope we can keep in touch through all of these different venues. But don't forget, shoutlearning.org is one place you can go to keep in touch. We're going to take a maybe 2-minute break here, and then proceed with our next session, which, as you know, will be with Pat McGonigal, who's going to be talking about how to inspire our students to look right beneath their feet and appreciate living, breathing, changing soils, and maybe even the soils under the feet of people in other parts of the world, following on our Global Competence theme. Veronica, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
We'll leave the evaluation link up on the top left for a few moments, and then we'll be back with Pat McGonigal in just a moment.